Imagine a family who owned a piece of land for over 100 years, a shimmering lake passed down from a once enslaved ancestor who worked his entire life just to give his children a place where no one could ever tell them they didn't belong. Yet, in the present day, that legacy became the target of the town's powerful white homeowners association, a group that couldn't stand the thought of a black family holding something so beautiful, so valuable, in the middle of their white-controlled paradise. They called the Carters out of place, undeserving, even stains on the neighborhood. And little by little, they turned public meetings into humiliation rituals, sneering as they told the family to do the right thing and sell what was theirs, branding them as selfish, as outsiders, as people who didn't belong in the very town their blood had helped build. Soon, the HOA's harassment grew relentless. Coded letters slipped under their door demanding they vacate. Lawsuits filed over fabricated violations, and whispered threats that black folks never last long when they try to fight power. Still, the Carters held on, watching in agony as bulldozers tore up their shoreline, as cabins rose around their lake like teeth biting into sacred ground, as vacationers laughed and partied on waters that once echoed with their children's joy, and every insult cut deeper. Every meeting left them smaller. Every smirk from their white neighbors was a reminder that in this place they were never seen as equals, never allowed peace, never allowed dignity. Yet what the HOA didn't understand, what the town refused to see, was that the lake carried memory, pain, and a will stronger than their greed. And when the skies finally darkened, when the storm came without warning, the same waters they tried to claim turned against them with a fury no law could contain, swallowing cabins, tearing foundations apart, and leaving only one house untouched. The Carters, standing tall on the hill, as if the lake itself had chosen its side. This isn't just a story about land, but about how far racism will go to humiliate, to strip, to erase, and how sometimes justice doesn't come from courts or neighbors, but from forces greater than any HOA could control. And if you think this family's fight was just about property, wait until you see how much hate was poured into trying to destroy them, and how one storm made the world remember exactly who this land truly belonged to. The story begins with the Carters, a proud black family whose roots ran deeper than the soil surrounding the shimmering lake they called home. A lake not born from privilege but from sacrifice, sweat, and generations of resilience. Their great-grandfather, Elijah Carter, once a freedman with little more than a pair of calloused hands, had worked himself into the ground to buy this land when the world told him a black man owning property was almost unthinkable. And though his neighbors sneered, spat, and sometimes threatened, he built a cabin by the water's edge where his children could run without fear, where no overseer's shadow could ever follow them again. Decades later, Elijah's descendants still clung to that promise. The lake shimmering like liquid glass beneath towering pines. The air thick with the laughter of black joy that so often seemed forbidden in a country built to suppress it. And, for the Carters, every sunrise over the water was more than beauty. It was proof that their family had carved out a sanctuary in a world that tried to deny them peace. But to the town surrounding them, a town still ruled quietly by the power of old money and old prejudice, that sanctuary was an irritation, an eyesore. A reminder that in the very heart of their white-controlled community, a black family had something they couldn't control. And as the years rolled on and wealth spread through the county, whispers turned to schemes, schemes that took form in the Homeowners Association, a collective of polished smiles and iron fists who wanted the Carters gone. Their lake rebranded as a community attraction, their heritage erased under glossy brochures advertising exclusive retreats for outsiders who'd never know the story buried beneath the waters. At first, the harassment came softly. Petty complaints about fence lines, condescending notes about property standards, muttered comments about not fitting in at neighborhood gatherings. But the message was clear. The Carters didn't belong, no matter how long they'd lived there, no matter how deep their roots ran. And when the Carters refused to bow, the pressure only mounted. Lawsuits piling on fabricated violations, police cars idling too long near their driveway, whispers about maybe it's time they leave before things get ugly. Yet through it all, the Carters endured, the lake their shield. Its rippling surface reflecting the dignity they refused to surrender. And while their children grew up knowing both the sweetness of summer swims and the bitterness of racist slurs hurled from passing boats, they also grew up knowing that resilience was their inheritance. That to give up the land was to let their ancestors' struggle be for nothing. And so, when the HOA unveiled their grand plan to transform the lake into a commercialized playground, to build rows of white-owned cabins on property they claimed was underutilized, to strip the Carters of the last thing tying them to their history, the family found themselves at a crossroads, standing alone in a battle where money, power, and prejudice stacked high against them. A battle not just for land, but for dignity, for identity, for the right to exist without apology in a town that had never stopped seeing them as intruders. The neighbors who smiled to their faces whispered venom behind their backs. Children at school repeated the cruel words their parents spoke at dinner tables, and even in church. The Carters could feel the weight of gazes that said, "You don't belong here." Every corner of life seemed to tighten with hostility, and though they tried to live quietly, to mind their own, the Carters realized that this wasn't simply about property lines or HOA disputes. It was about the audacity of a black family daring to hold on to something valuable, something untouchable, in a world that still wanted them erased. And that realization sent a shiver through their home. For while the HOA fought with paper and courts, the Carters felt a darker fight rising, one that reached beyond men, beyond laws, into the very heart of the lake itself, as if the water remembered every insult, every act of disrespect, and was waiting, silently, for the day it would rise in their defense. And as storms brewed on the horizon, both in the sky and in the hearts of their enemies, the stage was set for a reckoning that would shake not just the Carters, not just the HOA, but everyone who had ever dared to underestimate the power of a people's resilience and the wrath of nature when it carries generations of pain in its depths. As months turned into years, the battle between the Carters and the HOA became less a dispute and more a suffocating storm, each passing week tightening around the family like a noose. What had begun with petty fines and veiled insults now escalated into open hostility, the HOA's polished facade of community improvement peeling away to reveal its true core of prejudice, greed, and disdain for the black family whose mere presence by the lake defied their vision of a pristine retreat. Neighbors who once exchanged awkward smiles now openly crossed the street to avoid the Carters, whispers swelling into full-throated accusations, lowering property values, inviting trouble, ruining the neighborhood's image, as if the laughter of black children on the shoreline was a stain on the picture-perfect postcard the HOA tried to sell. White families began circling the Carters' home like vultures, arriving with offers that were never truly offers but insults wrapped in polite language, checks that could never replace the blood and history in that soil, the smug tone, always the same: be smart, take this, move on before it gets worse. But for the Carters, there was no moving on. For the land was not a possession but an inheritance. The lake, not a commodity, but a lifeline tied to ancestors who had endured chains, segregation, and humiliation to secure even this sliver of freedom, and so each offer was met with the same quiet refusal. Though behind the dignity in their voices, fear slowly seeped into their bones. For they knew the HOA did not accept defiance lightly. Then came the inspections, white officials with clipboards strolling their property as though it were already theirs, nitpicking chipped paint, invented code violations, phantom safety hazards, fines stacking higher than the family's monthly income, threats of foreclosure whispered like knives. The Carters scraped together money where they could, borrowing, hustling, sacrificing. Yet the debts only deepened, the sense of being cornered sharpened, and still the family refused to yield, their unity becoming a thorn in the HOA's side. A reminder that power met resistance here, that prejudice had not won yet. But prejudice is patient, and cruelty finds new weapons. And soon, the harassment spilled into daily life, their mailbox torn down, tires slashed, Their children mocked at school, with words too hateful to repeat, and though the police were called, reports were filed, nothing came of it, the officers offering nothing more than thin smiles and shrugs, as if silently saying, "This is the price of staying where you don't belong." Nights grew heavier, shadows lingered longer, and the lake, once a place of laughter and calm, became a mirror for their fear. Its waters dark and restless under the moon, as if absorbing the weight of their suffering. And yet, even as the family clung to hope, the HOA pushed harder, filing lawsuits claiming the Carters' land was improperly owned, citing old, twisted legal loopholes that smelled of the Jim Crow era, their attorneys speaking with venom-dipped tongues about historic covenants designed to keep black families out of such neighborhoods, words dressed in law but dripping with the same hatred their ancestors had once codified into chains. The Carters' every step was haunted by the question, how much longer can we endure? Their mother, weary but unbowed, prayed by the lake at dawn, whispering to Elijah and the generations beyond, asking for strength, for protection, for some sign that their suffering was not unseen. And though her children tried to keep their heads high, the cruelty gnawed at their innocence, their teenage daughter coming home in tears after being cornered by classmates who spat vile words at her, their son returning with bruises after a game that was nothing but an ambush. The Carters' father's once strong shoulders bent lower each day under the weight of endless court summons and mounting debt. His dignity fraying as he sat at the table late into the night, papers spread before him, the sound of his pen scratching out futile defenses against an enemy with deeper pockets and sharper claws. And yet, amidst this growing despair, the family's bond only strengthened. Their dinners filled with both silence and determination. Their nights punctuated by whispered reassurances that they would not let this land be stolen, not let Elijah's dream be erased. But determination alone could not keep the storm at bay. And soon the HOA launched its boldest strike yet. Construction crews arriving at the edges of the lake, bulldozers rumbling like beasts, cabins beginning to rise on land. The Carters still called their own, as if the HOA had already written them out of existence. The sight was a gut punch, each hammer strike a reminder that the town believed it could build over their history, pave over their identity, erase their legacy with wood and nails. Neighbors cheered the progress, realtors spoke excitedly of exclusive vacation homes, while the Carters watched helplessly, their pleas dismissed, their protests ignored, their voices drowned beneath the roar of machinery and the cold laughter of those who saw them as nothing more than obstacles. The injustice burned hotter with each passing day, the weight of hopelessness pressing down on them like the humidity of summer storms. And in that suffocating despair, it seemed the world had conspired to strip them of everything, to prove once more that no matter how hard black families fought, no matter how much they endured, society would always find new ways to remind them of their place. But in the quietest hours of the night, as the machines slept and the world fell still, the lake itself seemed to stir, its waters rippling, though no wind touched it, its depths dark and alive, as if remembering the hands that built it, the sweat that christened its shores, the pain it had witnessed through generations. And though the Carters did not yet know it, the lake was listening, absorbing their anguish, storing their rage, waiting for the moment when injustice would tip too far, when the scales would demand balance, when nature itself would rise to remind men that no amount of prejudice, no wealth, no polished HOA signatures could ever own what was consecrated by sacrifice. And as the Carters looked out across the water, despair clawing at their hearts, they could not shake the feeling that the lake, silent and brooding, was not just watching, but preparing, waiting for the day it would answer their cries in a way no one could ignore. The breaking point arrived, not as a thunderclap, but as a slow, suffocating crescendo of cruelty that finally tore through the fragile threads holding the Carters together. The cabins now stood tall, smug monuments of stolen land, their wooden beams gleaming beneath the sun, as if mocking the family. Every hammerstrike still echoing in their bones, every wave of laughter from vacationers settling in around the lake like salt in their wounds. The HOA, no longer hiding behind polite letters or shadowy fines, now moved with open arrogance, sending armed sheriffs to the Carters' property with eviction notices stapled to their front door. Deputies, who smirked as they ripped the family's trespassing signs from the ground, their tone dripping with superiority as they informed them they had no right to live on association land, though the Carters' deed still sat framed in their living room, signed generations ago by Elijah himself. Neighbors gathered in clusters to watch, murmuring venom laced with self-righteousness. They should be grateful we let them stay this long. Finally, the neighborhood will be clean again. Those people never fit here anyway. Their words stabbing sharper than any blade. Their gazes stripping the Carters of their humanity as if they were intruders in the very soil their ancestors had bled to claim. And when the Carters protested, pleading, showing their papers, their history, their truth, the officers laughed, their hands resting on their holsters, daring the family to resist. Their smirks saying louder than words, "In this country, your blackness will never outweigh our whiteness, no matter what signatures or laws you hold." The children cried as strangers trespassed through their yard, officials measuring boundaries that had never belonged to them, vacationers gawking from a distance, snapping photos as if the Carters were exhibits in a spectacle of removal. As if the suffering of a black family was entertainment, the family's matriarch knelt by the lake that evening. Her prayers no longer whispers but cries of desperation. Her voice trembling as she begged the water to carry her pain. To do what her hands could not, for every courtroom had been bought, every law twisted against them, every plea silenced beneath the weight of prejudice disguised as policy. And it was here, at the edge of despair, that the tension which had simmered for years cracked open like a fault line. For, as the HOA celebrated the opening of its 50th cabin with a ribbon-cutting ceremony on the opposite shore, the Carters stood isolated, bruised by humiliation yet burning with rage. Watching the spectacle unfold, the white families in pastel clothes sipping champagne on what was once their grandfather's sacred ground. Their laughter carried across the water like a cruel chorus. Their children splashing in the lake as if it had never belonged to anyone else, erasing with their joy the decades of struggle and history buried beneath those waves. The Carters' patriarch stood tall that night, for the first time in weeks. His eyes hollow but his jaw set, his silence heavier than thunder. For he had reached the moment every oppressed man dreads, the point at which dignity cannot survive without defiance, the point at which suffering transforms into resolve, even if it means destruction. And so, when the skies darkened and the crowd of vacationers toasted beneath lanterns strung along the docks, the Carters retreated into their home, their faces shadowed, their voices low, their children clinging to them with fear that something irreversible was about to unfold. The lake churned that night, its waves restless though no wind touched them, as if it too could sense the fury boiling just beyond the surface, as if it too hungered for release. And when the Carters emerged once more into the night, carrying nothing but lanterns and the weight of their ancestors on their backs, the air thickened, the silence electric, the HOA's laughter still ringing faintly from across the water. The patriarch stepped to the dam, his hand steady as he touched the rusted mechanism Elijah had once built, a structure holding back not only water, but generations of rage, humiliation, and buried cries for justice. And in that moment, with the eyes of his family watching, the prayers of his wife echoing, the fear of his children trembling in the air, he made a choice that would forever alter the lake's history. He pulled the lever. The dam groaned like a beast awakening from centuries of slumber, metal grinding against stone as the first trickle of water seeped through, swelling into a torrent, and then, with a roar that swallowed the laughter from across the lake, the barrier gave way, unleashing a flood not just of water but of vengeance. Nature itself answering years of injustice with a force no man could restrain. The cabins, those smug wooden monuments to greed, shook as the waves struck, their foundations splintering beneath the surge, vacationers screaming as champagne glasses shattered, their laughter turning to panic, their pastel clothes drenched, as the waters rose, carrying away the illusions of ownership, tearing apart the structures built on stolen land, dragging them into the depths with a fury so primal it seemed orchestrated by the ancestors themselves. The HOA leaders shouted orders, their polished shoes sinking in the mud. Their voices drowned beneath the chaos, their arrogance stripped bare as they scrambled like frightened children before the power of the very lake they had tried to conquer. Their empire of cabins collapsing plank by plank, swept away as if the water itself remembered the Carters' pain and demanded payment in kind. And through it all, the Carters stood at the shoreline, watching as history inverted itself, as the same community that had mocked, fined, harassed, and belittled them now tasted the terror of powerlessness. Their screams, a haunting echo of every dismissal, every insult, every threat the family had endured. But the destruction was not mindless. It was deliberate, surgical, sparing only the Carters' home on the hill, leaving it standing as a solitary witness to the truth that no amount of prejudice, no collection of signatures, no walls of cabins could erase what had been consecrated by sacrifice. The lake had answered, the ancestors had stirred. And though the Carters had risked everything in that one act of defiance, as dawn broke and the waters calmed, there was no mistaking the message carved into the ruins. You cannot steal what was never yours, you cannot erase what was written in blood, and you cannot silence a family who refuses to be erased. When the waters finally stilled, and the chaos faded into a hollow silence, the Carters' land stood transformed, not as a battlefield of loss, but as a graveyard of arrogance. The once proud cabins, now broken husks scattered across the lake's edges, their twisted beams jutting out like the skeletons of an empire that should never have been built. News crews arrived within hours, their cameras capturing the devastation. Their microphones pointed at HOA leaders who stammered excuses about unforeseen natural failure, while avoiding the questions about why they had built on stolen soil. In the first place, their trembling voices a stark contrast to the unwavering silence of the Carters, who remained on their porch unflinching, their presence alone a testimony that survival itself was victory. Across the nation, headlines blared lakefront cabins destroyed in dam collapse. Black family at center of dispute left standing. Nature strikes back against HOA empire, yet beneath the sensationalism lay a deeper conversation that could no longer be ignored about race, power, and the quiet violence inflicted not by fists or guns, but by laws, fines, whispers, and systems designed to suffocate families like the Carters. In churches, barbershops, schools, and living rooms, people debated whether the flood was an accident or a reckoning. Some condemning the Carters as reckless destroyers, while others lifted them as symbols of generational resilience. And though the HOA filed lawsuits, demanded prosecutions, and painted themselves as victims, the truth hung heavy in the public eye. They had underestimated not only the family they sought to erase, but also the land itself, a land that seemed to remember who it truly belonged to. And as weeks turned to months, the lake began to heal, swallowing the debris, covering the scars, reclaiming what had always been its own. While the Carters, though scarred by the ordeal, found themselves reborn in the eyes of their community. No longer just a black family clinging to their rights, but a living reminder that dignity could not be legislated away, that resilience could not be bulldozed, that history could not be drowned beneath cabins and contracts. Their children, once mocked and belittled, grew into storytellers, carrying the memory of that night as both warning and hope. Their voices echoing Elijah's legacy, ensuring that the lake would never be remembered merely as water but as testimony. Proof that the fight for respect is as much about survival as it is about justice. And perhaps that is the truest impact of it all. That long after the headlines faded, long after the ruins of the cabins rotted into the earth, long after the HOA dissolved under the weight of lawsuits and shame, the Carters' story lived on, whispered by waves, carried by winds, and retold by those who understood that racism, though it wears new disguises, is still the same old theft of humanity, and that every act of defiance, whether in a courtroom, on a street, or at the edge of a dam, plants a seed of reckoning. So, as the sun set over the water, painting it gold as if to sanctify it once more, one truth lingered like a shadow across every heart that knew the story. You can steal land, you can rewrite laws, You can humiliate and threaten, but you cannot erase a people who choose to stand, for sooner or later, the ground itself will remember, and when it does, will we call it disaster, or will we finally admit it was justice? The story of the Carter family begins like so many tragedies in America, quietly and without fanfare, in a small southern town where their land, a sprawling lakefront property passed down through generations, stood as both sanctuary and burden. A living reminder of Elijah Carter, a freedman who had once fought against all odds to buy it during Reconstruction. For years, the Carters lived in relative peace, raising children, fishing from the water's edge, and protecting the land from those who had always whispered it didn't belong to them, until the whispers grew into meetings. And the meetings birthed a homeowners association, run almost exclusively by white residents who viewed the Carters' heritage not as a right but as an inconvenience, a blemish on the image of wealth and uniformity they wanted to project, and so began a campaign of suffocation, endless citations, petty fines, backhanded letters demanding the Carters cut their grass shorter, paint their home a community-approved color, stop parking trucks on their own property, each rule written not to uplift, but to strangle. Soon the pressure escalated, and what started as annoyance became an organized effort to seize the land, an effort masked in legal jargon and neighborhood votes but dripping with centuries of the same poison that had always told black families to move along, step aside, give way. The Carters, dignified yet weary, resisted with everything they had. But resistance came at a cost, as neighbors who once nodded in passing now crossed the street. Children were taunted at school, and stores began refusing service under flimsy excuses, until the family found themselves not just isolated but targeted. A silent war that echoed with the old, bitter hymn of racial exclusion. It was then that the HOA unveiled their grand project, announcing plans to transform the lakefront into a luxury vacation retreat with 139 cabins. A place for tourists and wealth. A place with no room for the Carters. And though the family fought in court, they were dismissed, their voices smothered under money, connections, and the invisible weight of systemic bias that ruled whose grievances mattered and whose did not. And so construction began, cabins rising like monuments to arrogance, blotting out the sky the Carters once called their own, each hammer strike, a reminder of the theft in motion, each delivery truck, a declaration that their history was disposable. Yet what no one realized, perhaps blinded by greed, was that Elijah Carter had not simply left his descendants land, but knowledge, and deep beneath the soil. At the heart of the lake itself lay an old dam he had built decades earlier, a dam that had sustained the water, a dam whose release could undo everything. And as the cabins stood gleaming, fully furnished, ready for wealthy vacationers to laugh where generations of Carters had prayed, the weight of history pressed too heavy to bear, until the family made a choice, not in rage but in reclamation, not to destroy but to remind, and with hands steady yet hearts heavy, they pulled the lever, releasing a flood that roared like centuries of silenced voices finally given form, swallowing the cabins in a single night, tearing wood from foundations, splintering glass, erasing the false empire built upon stolen dignity, while the Carters stood in the distance, watching not with triumph but with tears, for they knew such acts carried both freedom and consequence. When the waters stilled and dawn broke, the world arrived, cameras capturing the wreckage, HOA leaders fumbling excuses about unforeseen structural failures, their pale faces betraying fear, while the Carters sat silently on their porch, neither confessing nor denying, for the truth was larger than words. A truth written in the ruins scattered across the shoreline. Newspapers debated endlessly, some vilifying the family as reckless saboteurs, others painting them as symbols of unyielding resilience. But the real story was not about property or cabins, it was about the centuries-long struggle of a people who were always told they did not belong. About the quiet violence of paperwork and ordinances designed to choke life from those already bearing the weight of history. And as weeks passed, the lake began to heal, swallowing the scars, reclaiming its natural beauty. While the Carters, though scarred themselves, remained a living monument that survival itself was defiance. Their children grew into storytellers, carrying the memory of that night as proof that power is never given but taken, that racism is not always shouted with slurs but whispered in contracts, that the fight for dignity is fought not only in marches but also in the silence of homes, where families decide how much more they can endure. And perhaps that is the lesson the ruins left behind, that no matter how many times history tries to erase, rewrite, or suffocate, the ground itself remembers. The waters themselves resist, and those who stand their ground, even against impossible odds, plant seeds of reckoning for generations to come. So the next time someone says racism is over, or that families like the Carters are too angry or uncooperative, remember the cabins that stood briefly, arrogantly, before the flood. Remember the HOA that believed laws could replace justice. Remember the silence of a family who chose endurance over submission. And ask yourself, when land and dignity are stolen, when systems suffocate with polite cruelty, when a people are told again and again to disappear, what else is left but to remind the world that justice is not always orderly, not always neat, and sometimes justice sounds like